The chapel was cold, the kind of cold that seeped beneath skin and settled into bone. I sat alone 2 rows from the back, while the Gradens, my daughter-in-law's family, filled the front like they owned the air we all breathed. Their sleek coats, stiff postures, and whispering mouths were a performance, a display of importance. None of them cried. I didn't either. Not because I wasn't broken, but because my grief had gone beyond tears. It had calcified into something else, a quiet ache I carried in my chest like a stone. From my corner of the pew, I saw Seraphine's mother lean toward her sister. Her lips barely moved, but the venom still carried. She thinks she's getting anything. Her sister stifled a laugh behind a gloved hand. I stared straight ahead. The stained glass window above the pulpit blurred through my peripheral vision, the light behind it dull and gray. I didn't flinch. I didn't blink. I'd heard worse. Just never from people who had shared dinner at my table years ago when I was still allowed to matter. My son's casket sat in front of them, all glossy and unblemished, like none of us. Inside lay the body of a man I hadn't truly spoken to in nearly 4 years. He'd grown distant, polite, then mechanical. By the end, even holidays were reduced to group texts and forwarded emails from Seraphine. I used to tell myself it was just life. Marriage, pressure. Maybe I'd been too sentimental, too simple. But I knew my son. Or I thought I did. The eulogy was sterile. Seraphine spoke with poise, thanking donors' colleagues, the board. Not once did she mention Ellison as a father or a son. When it was over, chairs scraped and coats rustled. I moved slowly, hoping to be the last out. The fewer eyes on me, the better. But then the door at the front of the sanctuary opened again, and a tall man in a gray coat stepped inside. He walked with quiet purpose down the center aisle, not looking at anyone but me. "Mrs. Callister," he asked. I nodded, standing up. "I'm Dane Morley," he said gently. "Your son asked me to be here. There's something he left behind." From his pocket, he removed a small black USB drive and held it like something sacred. I raised Ellison with hands that always ached. From the scrubbing, the lifting, the holding on too tight. After Bram died 27 years old, a faulty anchor chain, and one slip off the marina dock. I didn't have the luxury of breaking. I had Ellison. 5-year-old eyes too big for his face, asking if Daddy would still read to him at night. So I worked nights at the hospice and cleaned offices during the day. I made pancakes from boxed mix and cut fruit into stars. I read him old classics by flashlight when the power bill was overdue. And when he got into Yale on scholarship, I sold my grandmother's wedding ring to pay for the travel deposit. He sent letters that first year, beautiful ones written in fountain pen, the kind I kept in a locked wooden box under my bed. In every one he told me about the food, the cold, the weight of expectations. I told him not to worry about me, that I was fine, that I was proud. He came home less and less after graduation. I understood. He was building something, his startup, his marriage. But even when he was in town, he never stayed at the lake house. "It's a long drive from the airport, Mom," he'd say. "You know how traffic is." Then came Seraphine, tall, manicured, always perfectly buttoned. She came with a family name that opened doors and closed others. When they got engaged, I congratulated them. When they moved to New York, I sent care packages. When they sent back a formal wedding invitation addressed to Mrs. M. Callister, no Mom or Marwin, I said nothing. Over time, the warmth thinned. The calls became appointments, and then not even that. On his last birthday, I mailed him a signed first edition of a sci-fi novel he loved as a boy. It was wrapped in indigo paper ribbon, tied like the ones I used to put on his lunchbox. 3 days later, I got a text, "Thanks, Mom." No punctuation, no photo, no call. I told myself he was just busy, building, achieving, enduring. But something had begun to rot underneath the silence, and I had no idea how deep it went until the day I showed up for Noel's birthday. I arrived at the Graydons' townhouse in Portland with the quilt folded neatly in my arms, tied with a soft blue ribbon. It had taken me 4 months, every square sewn by hand, each patterned with stars, moons, and tiny constellations. I embroidered Noel's name in the center in gold thread. He loved the stars. At least he did when I last saw him. The front gate buzzed, but didn't open. A moment later, Seraphine's father stepped outside in a pressed suit and scarf that probably cost more than my car. He didn't look surprised to see me. "Marwin," he said too casually, "this isn't a good time. I just wanted to drop something off for Noel," I said, holding out the bundle. "I won't stay. I know it's his party." His smile didn't touch his eyes. "Yes, well, the event is private, just family." I stood there a moment longer, uncertain if I should push. I didn't. I nodded, murmured something polite, and walked back to the car with the quilt still in my hands. The gate closed behind me before I reached the sidewalk. That night, I repackaged the quilt with tissue paper and sent it through priority mail. I wrote a note, nothing dramatic, just a birthday wish, and a line that said, I hoped he would sleep well under the stars. I never got a thank you, never got a photo, nothing. A month later, I tried again. I sat at the kitchen table and wrote Ellison a letter, not a message, not a card, but a real letter. 4 pages inked carefully. I told him I missed him, that I didn't need anything from him, just the truth. I sealed it and addressed it to his office at Callister and Quain in Manhattan. The letter was never returned. I checked the mailbox every afternoon for 2 weeks. When nothing came, I convinced myself it had arrived, that maybe he just didn't know what to say. It wasn't until Noel said something at the funeral that I realized those words may have never reached him at all. The reception was held at a hotel ballroom too lavish for mourning. Everything smelled of orchids and polished silver. Waitstaff moved like ghosts between tall floral arrangements, placing hors d'oeuvres no one touched. I hovered near the wall, invisible by design. Noel stood near the dessert table, his small frame lost between the legs of adults who barely noticed him. He clutched a paper cup of lemonade and looked pale, the way children do when grief hangs too heavily in a room. I walked over slowly and crouched beside him. "Hi, sweetheart," I said gently. "Are you holding up okay?" He nodded, eyes on the floor. Then he glanced around as if checking to make sure no one was listening. He leaned closer. "Daddy used to look at your pictures," he whispered. I blinked. "What pictures?" He hesitated, then said, "The ones from your gallery. The ones with all the blue." My breath caught in my throat. "Did he show them to you?" "No," Noel said. "But he had them on his computer. I saw them one night." He cried. I couldn't move. I didn't know what to do with the words. I had never told Ellison about that gallery show. It wasn't on social media. I hadn't mailed an invite. I'd stopped trying by then. Yet somehow he had found them, saved them, looked at them in the quiet. He told me the water ones looked like when we went to the lake. Noel added, sipping from his cup. He said you used to take him there. I swallowed hard. My hands trembled as I reached up to smooth his hair. Yes, I said softly. That's exactly what they were. Someone called Noel from across the room. He gave me a quick hug before running back toward his cluster of Graydon cousins. I watched him go, heart split wide by the weight of memory and revelation. The rest of the reception blurred. Faces passed. Voices droned. But that small whisper from a child echoed louder than everything else. By the time Dane approached me again, near the coat room, my hands had stopped shaking, but my mind had not. Dane found me just as the hotel staff began clearing trays. He didn't say much, just that it was time, and Ellison had left very specific instructions. A private room had been arranged. Only family, he said, though judging by the people entering ahead of me, family seemed to have a fluid definition. The Graydons gathered around the long, polished table like they were preparing for a stockholder meeting. Seraphine sat stiffly between her parents, her lips pressed into a neutral line, but her eyes gleamed like she already knew the outcome. I took the chair closest to the door. Dane stood at the head of the table with a laptop and small projector case. He looked out over the room and spoke with measured calm. As executor of Ellison Callister's will, he said, "I've been instructed to begin this process with a recorded statement. The formal reading of the legal documents will follow." There were a few exchanged glances, mild curiosity, perhaps even amusement. A video, Seraphine's father scoffed, unusual. Dane ignored him and plugged in the USB. The lights dimmed. The projector flickered to life. A few seconds of black screen, and then Ellison appeared. He was seated at a desk wearing one of his gray sweaters, the one I'd bought him for his 30th birthday. He looked thinner, worn. His skin had a translucent quality, and though he smiled faintly, there was something heavy in his expression. He looked directly into the camera. The room went still. "If you're seeing this," he said, his voice low but clear, "then I'm gone. I hope this finds you with a measure of peace, though I know that may be too much to ask." I felt my breath catch. There are things I need to say. Some of them won't be easy to hear, but they're true. And I need to start where it matters most. He paused, eyes fixed straight ahead. "Mom," he said, "this is for you." And as the image of my son, gone yet suddenly present, held the room in suspension, I felt something inside me begin to brace for what was coming next. "Mom," Ellison said, his voice steady. "I need to start by saying something I should have said a long time ago. I'm sorry." My hands gripped the arms of the chair as if grounding myself in them might steady my heart. On the screen, he exhaled softly. "I believed things I shouldn't have. I let distance grow between us and convinced myself it was natural, inevitable. But it wasn't. It was manufactured, and I let it happen." He glanced down, then back at the camera. "A few months ago, I started noticing little things. Missed messages, invitations that Seraphine claimed you'd ignored. But then I found her old laptop. There was a secondary email account, one I never knew she had. It was tied to my name, but it wasn't mine." My breath hitched. "She used it to block your emails, rewrote anything you sent to spam, and worse, she flagged your name on our home mailing system so that your letters would be set aside for review. She told me they never came. I believed her." He looked right into the lens then, as if seeing only me. "I should have trusted my gut, Mom. I should have remembered who always showed up, who always loved me, even when I was too blind to see it." A murmur rose around the table, soft and nervous. Seraphine's mother shifted in her seat. Her father's jaw twitched. "But I see it now," Ellison said, "and that's why I made changes." He straightened slightly, his face hardening not with anger, but resolve. To my wife's family, he said, tone sharpening, "You've whispered long enough. You've laughed at the woman who raised me, while never once understanding what she gave up to do it." He paused. "Let me make it clear." His mouth pressed into a thin line. Then, without blinking, he said the three words that hollowed the room. "She gets everything." I heard someone gasp. Chairs shifted. The air changed. And I sat frozen, not from disbelief, but from the quiet, blooming sense that my son had finally come home. Ellison's voice never wavered. To my mother, Marwin Callister, he said, "I leave full ownership of my home in Beacon Hill, my personal investment portfolio, and all intellectual property rights to my written work, including my children's books and unfinished manuscripts." There were audible inhales across the table. One of the board members adjusted his collar. Additionally, Ellison continued, "I've established the Ellison Callister Foundation for Creative Futures. It will support young artists and coders from underserved communities. I've named my mother as the chair. I hope in time my son will help her lead it." I barely registered the mention of Noel. My eyes were fixed on the man in the video who looked so calm, so certain, as though this version of him had existed all along, just hidden behind glass. Then came the line that cracked the room. "To my wife, Seraphine Graydon Callister," he said, pausing just long enough to draw every eye, "I leave a one-time disbursement of $5,000 and a copy of How to Be Kind by Naomi Schulman." Someone choked. A nervous laugh sputtered, quickly smothered. The screen flickered for a moment as Ellison turned a page in his folder. But Seraphine had already stood up, her voice rising over his recorded one. "This is a farce," she snapped. "This isn't legal. He wasn't in his right mind." "Sit down," Dane said firmly, not looking at her. "The video isn't over. I won't be humiliated by this." She started, but Ellison's voice continued on, silencing her with its presence. "I knew this would upset some of you," he said almost wearily. "But I've made these decisions with clarity, not cruelty. I simply don't want the people who dismantled my family to profit from it." The board members sat rigidly. One of them, a man with silver hair and trembling hands, leaned toward Dane and whispered something I couldn't catch. All around me, the temperature had shifted. The Graydons were pale. Seraphine had folded her arms so tightly across her chest, her knuckles had gone white. But I stayed seated, hands in my lap, heart beating in steady disbelief. And then Dane reached for the legal folder to begin the reading. 2 days after the reading, Dane asked to meet me at a small cafe tucked off Hawthorne. He wore a look that felt more like compassion than formality, and when we sat, he slid a slim, leather-bound book across the table. "Your son asked me to give this to you personally," he said. I turned it over in my hands. It was worn at the edges, the cover soft from use. Ellison's handwriting greeted me on the inside page, looping and familiar, private. For clarity, not publication. I read it slowly, over hours, back in my hotel room with the curtains drawn. Page after page, his voice returned. He wrote about childhood memories I had long thought, forgotten how I used to hum while making pancakes, how I patched his backpack with navy thread and a tiny embroidered star. The entries shifted, became more reflective. He admitted he'd grown cold toward me, that he'd let other voices shape the silence between us. He blamed exhaustion, pressure, his pride. Then tucked into one page was a printed photo of my last gallery series, the one with the horizon lines, painted in tones of blue and rust. He had annotated the corner Lake Dunley dusk. I remember this sky. Toward the end, his writing grew more uneven. He mentioned starting chemo again, that he was tired all the time, that he wanted to visit me in Oregon. He'd even booked a ticket once, but canceled when the nausea hit hard. And then, on the final page, a single entry written a week before he died. They lied to me, but she always loved me. I see it now. I pressed my fingers to the ink as if I could feel his warmth still clinging to it. The ache in my chest didn't lessen, but it shifted into something weightier, rooted in recognition. He had seen me. At the end, he had reached back. I closed the journal and stared out the window of the city below, humming on without him. And then I thought of Noel, of what this legacy might become. The Beacon Hill house felt too quiet the first time I stepped inside. Ellison's scent, clean linen, faint citrus, still lingered in the hall, clinging to the curtains, the backs of doors. I stood in the foyer for a long while, unsure if I belonged in the space that once shut me out. But then I walked into the study and saw one of my paintings on the wall, framed, hung with care. I didn't sell the house. Instead, I moved in and opened every window. I met with an advisor Dane recommended. We went through Ellison's wishes, his financial portfolio, and by the end of the week, I'd filed paperwork for the Ellison Callister Art and Tech Fellowship. It would serve young dreamers' kids who painted on paper bags or coded on borrowed laptops, kids who needed someone to believe in them the way I had once believed in my son. The second thing I did was request a meeting with Callister and Quain's board of directors. They weren't expecting me to show up with no lawyer, no PR person, just a notebook and a binder of Ellison's final requests. I'm not here to take over, I told them, but I am here to keep his values alive. I asked about their culture, their hiring, their philanthropic footprint. I didn't yell. I didn't accuse. I simply held the weight of his wishes in the room and gave them a choice evolve, or I would quietly and swiftly pull my ownership out from under them. They listened. By the end of the quarter, internal restructuring had begun. A new mentorship program was proposed, one I would help fund. Not everyone liked the changes, but they understood they were not optional. I didn't feel triumphant, only steady. I visited the fellowship's first partner school a month later. The art room smelled of glue and sharpened pencils. One girl asked if I was someone important. I told her I was just someone who understood how far belief could carry a person. But it was back at the house weeks later, when the envelope from the Gradens arrived, that the stillness finally cracked. The envelope from the Gradens contained nothing more than a typed statement from their lawyer. No further communication will be initiated or welcomed, followed by a signature I didn't recognize. No mention of Seraphine. No acknowledgement of Noel. Just a final attempt at erasure, folded neatly in a white envelope. I placed it in the bottom drawer of Ellison's desk and closed it without a second thought. Months passed. The foundation grew faster than I expected. I split my time between Boston and Portland, balancing board meetings with gallery visits, speaking at schools, and walking along quiet lake trails when the noise got too loud. For the first time in years, I felt like I was standing in the middle of my own life, not at the edges of someone else's. Then 6 months to the day after the funeral, a small envelope arrived, this one addressed in a child's uneven handwriting. I opened it carefully, and inside was a folded sheet of lined paper with thick marker strokes and stars in the corners. a drawing. Me with silver hair and a red scarf, holding hands with a tall figure who had Ellison's eyes. Beneath it, in blue crayon, "Grandma drew you in art class. Daddy would be proud." Noel, I didn't cry. I just held the paper to my chest for a long time before folding it again as carefully as I might fold memory itself. That weekend, I returned to the cemetery. The stone was smooth and cold under my hand. I laid Noel's drawing at its base and sat beside it on the damp grass. "You saw me, son," I whispered. "I see you too now, and I'll carry you forward." The wind stirred around me. I don't know what I expected, maybe nothing. But I left feeling lighter. I walked back to the car as the sun began to set, behind the trees, casting long shadows that stretched and softened across the earth. And for once, those shadows didn't feel like things that were chasing me, but ones that I could finally walk beside.